Right. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our first series of intellectual discourse held by the Center of Islamic Economics. This is the title is Towards the Achievement of Sustainable and Humane Economic Development, the Role of ESG. I am Dr. Riyasat Amin Iman, and I'll be moderating this session. And a little about myself before we start. I'm a lecturer at the Department of Economics, and I lecture Islamic economics and economic development. And today's theme is focusing on sustainable economic development. Before we go on, a little bit of background on why we're having this session, first of all, and why we're focusing on this area. Many of you here may recall that we had a conference February 2024, the ICIEF, the 15th version. And the theme of that conference was sustainable and humane economy, achieving a sustainable and humane economy. And today's session is part of practically or pragmatically moving towards a sustainable and humane economy. So there was a post-conference agenda, and this is an extension or a part of that post-conference agenda. And the next thing, of course, is why would we be focusing on economic development? Of course, this is the economics department, so naturally we'll be focusing on economics. But besides that, we noticed that our conventional or the mainstream economic system has many shortcomings, particularly if we look at data from over the last 3 decades or so, even the last 4 decades. But it has become clear that our mainstream economic system has been falling short in many areas. Particularly, let me highlight maybe 5 of those areas. The first one would be that the mainstream economic system has been failing to protect the most economically vulnerable. Right? When we talk about those who are poor, even though we're able to deal to a large extent with the urban poor who are very close to the poverty line, we see that globally there are pockets of poor who are being left behind or who are we're not able to reach. Secondly, our mainstream economic system also enables a few at the cost of the many. Right? We see the rich and the political elite appear to be moving forward, whereas inequality or intra-inequality within countries, right, are getting worse. We also see that a lot of stagnation and economic and social upward mobility. So, people are not able to break out of a wealth bracket or income bracket. They're always stuck within their lifetime, and this is for the majority of people. And this has been a major issue. Another issue that we might see, particularly even in Malaysia, is the rising cost of living, whereby incomes are not able to keep pace with the cost of living. This has also been an issue. So even the economy's job to create value has been limited. And another very important point has been that different stakeholders are limited by their means and also by the system, when it comes to helping others. So even, for example, I may have the means or I have good intentions, we do not have a clear system of how stakeholders can help each other or enable one another. And this has been a problem. And this actually reduces the social bond between stakeholders generally, and it can, affect the cohesion within, social society or social systems. And as a result, what has been the response of the world? Of course, 3 decades, right? And these issues have been rising or has been coming to the fore. And our response has been, we have seen different frameworks coming up, right? We see, for example, the emergence of the MDGs and the SDGs, the more recent SDGs in 2015. We see, different frameworks coming up, for example, the value-based intermediation, the VBI. And of course, today's focus, which has been the ESG. So if you look at these these frameworks have come across to try and address the shortcomings of our mainstream economic system. And this is in line, of course, these are in line with achieving the sustainable and humane economy that we have been trying to push for. Now, the ESGs, of course, they have some advantages and disadvantages, which we'll be looking into today. The advantages include, for example, it's flexible and dynamic. There's no clear framework, and the idea of that is so that there's an easy opt-in. You can kind of define what ESG means to you or how you fit into the picture and move forward. However, the disadvantage would be that there's a lacking clear framework, and as a result, there has been accusations of greenwashing, and its credibility has come under fire. So today, to deliberate on this, so how will the session work? We're keeping it loose in terms of timing, but generally, our esteemed speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Williams, I'm going to invite him soon, and he will be delivering his talk for roughly 40 minutes to an hour, after which we will have a question-answer session. And then after that short question-answer session, then we will move to Professor Mansour Afifi, and he is going to deliberate on some of those things that Dr. Jeffrey Williams has spoken of, and he'll give us an idea of what those things mean, generally speaking, in the context of a sustainable and humane economy, right? So that's how it'll work. And let's move on to our esteemed speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Williams, who was able to make it despite a very busy schedule. Thank you for that. A little about him for those of you who may not have had the pleasure of meeting him yet. So Dr. Jeffrey Williams is an economist and the founder and director of Williams Business Consultancy, SDN Sendirian Berhad. Until April 2024, he served as a professor and provost at the University of Malaya and a visiting research fellow at Bank Negara, Malaysia. Previously, he held a position of Deputy Vice Chancellor at University Tun Abdul Razak, Uni Razak. Dr. Williams is a graduate of the University of Cambridge and has held academic positions at the London Business School, Pembroke College at the University of Oxford, and the University of London. He was a chartered fellow of the Chartered Management Institute and was elected fellow of the Royal Society of Arts in 2004. In 2010, he became a fellow of the Malaysian Institute of Management. His recent work has focused on economic policy, pensions policy, fiscal policy, income and labor market issues, and higher education management. He also has interest in sustainability, social responsibility, ESG finance and investment, and related policy analysis. Notably, Dr. Williams created the SRI Kehati Sustainability Index for the Indonesian Stock Exchange, and in 2017 was honored with a Lifetime Contribution Award for his work on corporate social responsibility, otherwise known as CSR, and sustainability globally. Dr. Williams is a regular media commentator and writes a weekly column on economics, business, and policy for Free Malaysia Today. His academic work has been published in leading international journals and has had a direct impact on the business world. In recent years, Dr. Williams has been active in public discourse, advocating for policies such as the implementation of a universal basic income in Malaysia to assist those in need. He has also proposed the establishment of a Malaysian super fund to support individuals without pension savings. This, by the way, is a short version of his bio. There's a lot more that we have left out. So hopefully we'll hear more about him as he speaks. Anyway, without any further ado, I have the pleasure of inviting Dr. Jeffrey Williams. I think your slides are ready. We'll just tap through. You just give me the signal. So maybe okay, you want to do this while
I can sit there.
all right.
It's a sedentary position. Okay, good morning. I might stand up and move around, but for the moment, if you don't mind, I'm feeling a bit like I should just sit down like you did.
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to come to IIUM. And I tend to discuss this type of topic when I come here. Generally, one way or another. So what I'm hoping to do this morning is, yes, we will go through issues of what is ESG and what is the contribution of ESG in economic development, and also what we mean by economic development and humane and sustainable economic development. What does that mean? Of course, we will discuss that. But I want to take an approach which is very much more academic. That is to apply some critical analytical thinking to it and not to take it on face value. But please don't imagine that this means that I am not a supporter of ESG or sustainability issues. I am, and I have been for a very long time, but I think we need to recognize, whenever I used to do this in the past, people would always say, oh, this is very new, we don't know very much about it. This is not true now. I mean, I've been in Malaysia for more than 20 years, so it's not new, because even 20 years ago, we were doing, we were discussing these issues in the context of corporate social responsibility. So it isn't new, and that's a very important thing to recognize. In fact, it's not just a matter of decades. It's a matter of it being around for thousands of years in the context of your religion and in the context of my religion. It has this idea of what we call now, in modern terms, sustainable humane economic development is actually just the foundation of our morality based on our faith. So it's actually been around for thousands of years, and I'll mention something about this in order for us to understand that this is not something that is new. And certainly at this stage, this is something that has gone through a very significant transition from where we were 20 years ago to where we are today. And of course, that then gives us something to think about in terms of where we will be even in the next 4 years under the Trump presidency and beyond that, whether these ideas of ESG will even survive that period, whether they should survive, or whether they should transform into some other way of looking at the world, or whether they are so embedded already in what we are doing that we don't care what what the politicians might say, because it actually, the question is it already, are we already at a position where we have already adopted these things as far as we could possibly adopt them, or do we have somewhere further to go? So these are the type of issues that I want to discuss. So it's a little bit different to what you might have expected. I will discuss all of the main issues, but from that point of view, I think it's important for us to think about it in a different way now, because we are genuinely in a different place. Okay, so this is what I'm going to look at. I'm going to do a brief history of the origins and evolution of what we now come to call ESG. I will look, the thing is, there are 1,000 different terms. Corporate social responsibility, ESG, sustainability, social responsible investment. And actually, we have had these discussions for the longest time, and frankly, I consider them to be, number one, very, very dull, very boring discussions. Basically semantics, and they have basically no meaning in any intellectual sense, because we are talking pretty much about the same thing, whether we talk about corporate social responsibility, social responsible investment, that's just a subset in the finance community, ESG, sustainability, whatever. We are always talking about the same basic topics. But I will mention quickly the origins and evolution of ESG. Then some of the motivations for ESG from a business perspective. Then I want to look at the reality of ESG, ESG perception and ESG implementation. And it's a harsh reality. Let me give you an advance warning. If you are in a delicate disposition, you might want to step out of that. Number three, when we get to number three, because it is actually quite harsh. And I personally don't find it unsurprising, but we will discuss that. Then I want to look at this issue I mentioned before about ESG and morality, ESG and religion, which is very important because actually just recently there was the conference on Islamic SDGs and whether that is a different subset to the SDGs or not. And then I want to focus on what we should be doing as in the academic institutions. And I'm going to show you a case study of one of the Malaysian institutions that has really taken this on in a large scale. And we can just have a quick look at what that would mean in a large scale or from their perspective. And then what is the future for ESG from what is our role as academicians in what might be the future? So that's basically what I want to. I hope you can see this because I chose gray for some reason. I thought not green. It's a bit useful. Anyway, the origins of ESG, corporate responsibility, however you want to describe it, actually go back thousands of years. There's no question about that. But in the sense of modern industrial economic activity, we can trace these things back in centuries, for sure. In fact, any of you who like chocolate, who like Cadbury's and Roundtree chocolate, these are organizations that were absolutely founded on what we now would call ESG or corporate responsibility or sustainability. But back then in the 19th century, and 18th and 19th century, even Leverhulme, who make, is now called Unilever, who make detergents and so on. From where I come from in Liverpool, very close by to us is a place called Ellesmere Port. And Ellesmere Port is a small town, village type thing that was set up by Lord Leverhulme as a corporate social responsibility exercise to look after his workforce. So even there, and that's in detergents, it's not. You can imagine a chocolate company would be nice to its workers, but even a detergent company would be nice. So we do have these things stretching back a long time, but in its modern form, we most often look at a statement, or actually there was more than one statement by Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, arch market economist, monetarist economist. And this is a bit of a bête noire. This is a bit of a straw man. You know, this is a sort of a statement that many people who advocate corporate responsibility use as the antithesis of what corporate social responsibility or ESG is. But I'm actually a huge fan of Milton Friedman. So for me, it's not the antithesis, it's actually the proper statement and the proper definition. It gives us the foundation that we must, where we must start, in my view. Now, in the 1970s, he wrote a couple of articles in the New York Times where he was asked this question about what is the social responsibility of corporations, companies. And his view was very straightforward, that the responsibility of companies was to look after the interests of their shareholders. And he defined that as being the profitability of the company. And people often take this as being a very rather harsh approach, that I don't care about anything else, I just care about the money. That's how it's often presented. But this is actually a misinterpretation of, in my view, and I think in the view of many market economists who understand this from a different perspective, it's a wholly wrong way to interpret what he's saying. Because from his perspective as a classical or neoclassical economist, the maximization of profit arises out of the efficient management of the organization. That's the basic principle of classical economics and profit maximization. It is not the desire for money for its own sake. That's not the point of it at all. You pursue maximization of profit, because it is the primary indicator of efficiency in the management of the organization. And if your organization is managed efficiently, it is much more likely to be sustainable. In that sense, I mean, in terms of longevity, it's more likely to survive as a successful going concern if it is profitable. And how do you make it profitable? By being efficient. And what are the indicators of efficiency? Proper management of the company. And what do we call proper management of the company? Responsible management of the company. And what is responsible management of the company? Looking after all of the interests of the company. Yeah. And so the insistence on profitability is because from a classical economic perspective, profitability indicates the efficiency of the organization. That keeps the organization going. And when you keep the organization, the business going, you can continue to support the employment of your employees. And if you don't, if your business is not profitable, the people who suffer first are not the shareholders. The people who suffer first are the workers. Why? Because they're the guys you sack when you can't run your company. They're the guys you cut their wages. They're the guys you force to work longer. The terms and conditions of their employment are progressively eroded. So if you are not actually looking at the proper management of your company, it's actually your employees who suffer first. Then your customers, because you start skimping. Your profits aren't high enough, you push up the price. They won't tolerate a higher price. Well, you reduce the quality, right? And we call it shrinkflation. You charge the same price, but you make the chocolate bars smaller, right? In other words, then the customers start to suffer, not the shareholders. Actually, the employees, then the customers. And what are we talking about now? Suddenly, we're talking about stakeholders. So once you start to look at it from that perspective, it's not so distant from talking about profit maximization to talking about stakeholder protection. Because from Friedman's perspective, profit maximization is about the efficiency of the management of the company. And if the company is managed efficiently, everybody is better off. And because everybody is better off, there is your social benefit. And therefore, maximization of the profits is the maximization of the social benefits. But he also was looking at it from another perspective, which we call the principal agent issue, which you will be, of course, familiar with, which is the owners of the company, the shareholders of the company are the principal. It is their company, right? And so it is your job as a manager to look after the interests of the owner of the company because it belongs to the company, to them. And Friedman argued in these articles what later was developed more extensively as in a principal agent approach. He basically said the managers have no fiduciary right to follow an agenda which is not given to them by the owner of the company. But he made the point, and people never mention this when they talk about the articles that Friedman wrote. He made the point that if the owners of the company have a charitable or a social obligation, and then tell you as the manager that you can do this or you should do this as part of the overall aims, then there is nothing wrong in doing it. And he even used the example of private hospitals, where in many private hospitals in the United States, they will treat people for free, pro bono. Okay, and they do that as part of their commitment to the local communities. And he said, if the owners allow that, then there is no problem. But a problem arises when the managers take on a social agenda which has not been given a mandate from the owners or from the board. Then there is a problem. And that is a governance issue. So that's the G. The E and the S and the G. You mustn't take on your own agenda if you haven't been given that mandate from your owners. That was the second part of his obligation. Sorry, his observations. And a third part of his observations were that if all companies behaved efficiently and were profit maximizing, the economy itself would be more effective, it would grow more, it would be more efficient. And we would have economic growth and we would have economic development if companies are allowed to do what companies are primarily set up to do, which is to run businesses, to run commercial enterprises. And so if all companies just focused on the running of commercial enterprises, you would maximize the outcome from the activities. And then what is his approach in terms of the social obligations? Well, let them maximize their profit, then tax them, then give the transfers through the government, because the government has the social mandate, yeah, not the company. Or don't tax them, maximize the wages, maximize the dividend to the shareholders, and let them fulfill their personal social obligations through transfer, through zakat, or through tithing, or through charitable contributions, or through social contributions. In other words, it's the individual who has an obligation to other individuals, or the individual who has the obligation to society as a whole, not the corporation. And if the corporations just focus on what it is that they do best, then you maximize economic outcome, economic growth, economic development, and you can deal with any problems with transfers or other mechanisms. That was essentially his approach. It isn't that he was just saying we should not have corporate social responsibility, nor is it that he was saying we should not care about other people. It's not that at all. So if you have that if you have that presented from the freedom view, that's a straw man, and that's not strictly correct. Now, in the 1980s, we see a change, and this is a change which doesn't necessarily come from an approach on corporate responsibility first. It comes from the approach to sustainable development. And this comes from the Brundtland report. And this defined sustainable development as a form of economic development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generation to meet their own needs. And that's where you get the sustainability issue. That we don't use up all the resources without any consideration to people in the future. And that it actually is not antithetical to the Friedman approach. Because the Friedman approach says if we use the resources efficiently, we will still have resources in the future. Yeah. But this is a different issue, because at this time in the 80s, we were very much concerned about renewable resources in particular. And this is an agenda that was very significantly focused on environmental issues. And the claim at that time that there would be a depletion of non-renewable energy sources. I remember when I was at school, that my geography teacher, J.R. Jones, yes, he told us then, which was in the 1980s, he told us then that we would have 10 years of gas and 20 years of coal. And then that would be it. 10 years of oil and gas and 20 years of coal. And that would be it. 20 years later, and 40 years later, well, 45 years later, we still have no end of these resources, which we were told 45 years ago, or even before that, half a century ago, we were told that these resources would be depleted by now, and that we would be in some sort of medieval or even earlier, some Stone Age environment where we wouldn't have lights and aircon and everything because we couldn't generate electricity. That's what we were told 50 years ago. And it simply wasn't. Well, it simply hasn't come to fruition. It's simply not true. Right? But at the time in the 1980s, it was a source of very significant concern because it was actually based on the evidence. It did appear that that was the situation. Known oil and gas reserves, known coal reserve, hydrocarbon reserves. Based on the known reserves, we were going to run out. And then we would have to look at alternative energies because future generations wouldn't have that resource. It was literally going to go. And the alternative energies are what? Well, then in the 1980s, the only feasible alternative was nuclear energy. There was no other feasible alternative. We were beginning to think about solar and wind and wave power, but the technologies were not there at that time. So the only feasible alternative was nuclear. But then, as we'll see later on, when we talk about the energy transition roadmap, the fact is that even with these alternatives today, where we have not a focus on nuclear, but a focus on hydroelectric and solar and wind and all of that, we have no chance of meeting the energy requirements that would be necessary in order to provide sustainable and humane economic growth. So if we were to cut back on all of that, we have to make a choice because it's a cost and benefit issue. And often this is called decoupling. We want to decouple economic growth from the environmental impact, right? But fundamentally, we want to deliver economic growth. And what does that mean? It means we have to increase and continue to increase economic output. Why? Because the population is increasing, right? In the 1980s, global population was 5 billion. What is it now? 7. So it's heading to 8. So because of that, we have to continue to increase the efficient use of economic resources, which as economists, that's our job to understand how to do that. If we don't do that, then we would necessarily have to have a lower standard of living for everybody, apart from the elite, who were able to capture it somehow through some sort of power capture. And that is not sustainable economic development. And it's not humane economic development. It's not equitable economic development. So the Brundtland report is helping us to understand what that means. You know, what do we mean by sustainable economic development? What that means is the economy must grow. The economy must continue to grow. Otherwise, people's standards of living will fall. And what does that mean? Their health outcomes will be worse, the education outcomes will be worse, the opportunities will be worse. And the choice that we have to make is what is the balance in terms of cost and benefit of looking at the environmental issues, as opposed to looking at the social issues. And then, I mean, we use ESG here, but often we also use the term environmental, economic, and social, or economic, environmental, and social. So it is the question of the extent to which we are going to sacrifice economic growth in order to protect the environment. And so that was really the start of that debate. It put really that, before that, we didn't care. The question of what should we choose, economic growth or the environment, we didn't care. The answer was clear, is economic growth, and had been for centuries. We always choose economic growth. Then the Brundtland report comes along and says, well, we have to start to make the choice. And that's where the debate came along in the 1980s. Now, in the 1990s, the question started to emerge. What is the role of the companies, the commercial sector, the corporations in this? And then, of course, what is the role of other stakeholders? What is the role of the government? What is the role of individuals? And in the 1990s, there was a very significant push on corporate social responsibility, which basically said corporations are such important stakeholders that they are at the core of what we want to achieve in terms of sustainable development and humane outcomes in terms of that. And we can't just allow them to get along with it and then sort of deal with it, like in the Friedman sense. You know, you just do what you want to do, and then we will deal with the consequences afterwards. And the observations in the 1990s were, if you behave better as a corporation, then we would have fewer problems that we would have to deal with through redistribution. And therefore, if we can balance all of these things, we can get a better outcome. And this is really at the core of what we mean by corporate social responsibility. And why is this different to ESG or sustainable development and so on? It's not. It isn't, because in corporate social responsibility, for example, the Bursa framework that first came out, we would talk about marketplace, treating consumers properly and behaving properly and ethically in the marketplace, safe products, selling at fair, reasonable prices. So marketplace. We would talk about workplace, treating your employees properly, paying them properly, looking after them, training them, health and safety in the workplace, respect. Then we would talk about the environment, looking after the environment, minimizing your energy use, minimizing waste, minimizing your carbon footprint, and then finally community, your contribution to the wider community outside of your organization. And people often misinterpreted corporate social responsibility as being the company takes some of its profit and gives it to a community group, or gives it to an environmental charity, or gives it to an orangutan sanctuary or something like that. In other words, it didn't matter how you made the money. In the end, you just took a bit of it and you reallocated it, and that satisfied your corporate responsibility. But the CSR approach in the 1990s was to say, no, it does matter, actually. It matters very much how you make money. It matters a great deal. If you make the money through a bad product, like tobacco or alcohol, then you cannot absolve yourself of that responsibility just by giving money to a charity afterwards, for example. If you are providing a good product, but you're not looking after your workers, you're paying them bad salaries, then you cannot justify that you're providing a good product if you're not treating your people well. So it's about, we often said it's about putting the issue of responsibility into the DNA of the company. And what's going on there is we are saying we have to change the way that we manage. We have to change the way that we think about how companies are managed. And then we're moving away a little bit from the basic classical economics of it, which is we don't care how they're managed, provided they're managed efficiently. We trust that within the black box of the company, the managers will just get it right, and the efficiency will be seen in the profit. That's how we deal with it in economics, when we don't care what goes on inside. But it moved to management, where the managers do care, and the managers are saying, no, you have to adopt responsible management approaches inside the company across those dimensions: environment, workplace, marketplace, and community. And then, of course, governance, because none of that can happen properly if you have bad governance, corporate governance. And that's where the focus was in the 1990s. And that sort of morphed or changed into ESG, because what was happening then was this idea that the financial markets play a huge role in this, because the financial markets are the ones who provide the capital to the company. They are the ones who buy the shares. They provide the loans. And if the financial sector can play a big role, then they can act as a driver of good activities amongst the corporates by telling the corporates, you know what, if you adopted a better management approach, I would expect to see a better financial outcome. And if I had a better financial outcome, I would invest more in your company. And that was part of the emphasis at the turn of the millennium. And the question then arose, how do we know, what were the indicators of your being a better company? Well, we have the Millennium Development Goals at that time. And I think 10, whether 10 millennium, 8. And then we have the Sustainable Development Goals developed later. Then we started to see standards emerging, the ISO 26000. But the ISO 26000 is not actually a formal standard like the ISO 1800, isn't it? The environmental standard. It's a set of guidelines. And then we started to see stock market activity. First, Malaysia introduced its guidelines. Before that, the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, the FTSE for Good Sustainability Index, started to rate companies on their environmental performance in order to try to push finance toward those companies. Can I get some water? And then we started to see mandatory reporting and mandatory disclosure, particularly amongst the listed companies, and particularly amongst the larger listed companies. And even now, we are starting to see mandatory disclosure emerging for smaller companies. So the Securities Commission has got its new sustainability reporting framework, and it's helping smaller companies to report. And that's what we saw in from the turn of the millennium up to where we are now. So the question then arises, where are we now? Well, if you look at, actually, let's focus here in Malaysia. If you look at the Madani principles, there is a whole section on sustainability. And at the core of that section on sustainability is a different conceptualization of what sustainability means in the Madani sense. It's actually the S. It's the social issue. And then it is the governance issue, although governance is also dealt with in other parts. And there is an explicit statement that the primary goal of sustainability policies is to focus on the social development or the social outcomes of the rakyat. That's the most important thing. Whereas if you were to look from Europe, the perspective from Europe, the Europeans would almost universally say the most important component is environment. Yeah. But if you look at in Asia, they would say, no, it's social. If you look in the United States, they would say, actually, no, it's governance. We only care if the companies run properly. Apart from that, we don't care, or we care less. So it's a matter of the prioritization and the ranking of it. But that's here in Malaysia, the Madani principles, and I thought that was really a very important statement. In fact, I wrote quite a lot about that, to say that it is very distinctive to say that when we talk about sustainability, we are primarily focused on the social aspect. And what we are also seeing now is an increasing skepticism about ESG. We are seeing issues about accusations of greenwash. I don't believe what you're telling me with this so-called mandatory reporting. Right? It's just not true. Right? And there is a genuine, reason for that. I mean, even Elon Musk, who makes electric cars, which people advocate as being an important alternative to hydrocarbon cars, normal vehicles. He has a very aggressive attitude toward ESG rating organizations because his company doesn't get a good, it doesn't get a good score. And he says, well, how can I possibly not have a good score when I'm producing exactly what it is that you've been asking us all to produce? So we often see that, but we also see companies which are objectively very bad companies. The cigarette companies, oil and gas companies, and these are often the ones that have the best sustainability score. But it cannot be if you look at the core business. And people are a little skeptical about that. So there's a trust deficit. We also see a trust deficit when we see companies that have a very good ESG score or a good sustainability score, and only to find out that they are up to their neck in some scandal. Governance scandal, environmental scandal, human rights scandal. They're banned from selling into market in the US, for example. I think, well, how many was it? 8 Malaysian companies were banned from selling into the US. 6 of them were GLCs. So all of them had fantastic sustainability ratings. And this is not, of course, unique to Malaysia. You see this all around the world. And so there is a skepticism that I cannot verify the claims that you're making about sustainability because we do not have independent verification. If you tell me that I have a 5-star sustainability program, it's normally because I paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to a commercial rating agency to tell you that I am a great company. And if I didn't pay them hundreds of thousands of dollars, they wouldn't have given me that rating. So there is a skepticism about that. And there is a return to this idea about the trade-off, that should we be trading off economic growth for environmental issues? Or are questions of social development, economic development, social infrastructure, education, health, access to jobs, good living conditions, social opportunities, are they much more important? And actually there is now a shift. And it may not be because of the election of Donald Trump, it might be COVID, for example, which basically said, you know what? We didn't care about the environment during COVID. Actually, the skies were clear. There were no planes, there was no pollution because nobody was moving around. And we were basically saying, well, if that's what we have to do in order to get clean air, we're not prepared to do it. Actually, what we really should be focusing on is the impact of a shock like that on individuals. In other words, the social aspect shifting. It might be that. I don't know what it is, but there is a shift. And even in the COP29, which was in Azerbaijan, this is a hydrocarbon-driven economy. They basically have nothing else other than hydrocarbons. And yet there was the center for this environmental conference, and they were basically saying it's growth that's important. Because if we can get economic growth, we can then invest that money into the remediation of the environmental problems. We can solve the environmental problems if we have the money. If we don't have the money, how can we solve the environmental problems? This is the sort of characterization of the change. And this is important because this appears to me to be where we are now. And as I mentioned earlier, people often used to say to me, and sometimes still say to me, this is a very new thing. It isn't a very new thing. And it appears to me what we need to reflect on why we are seeing a change. Well, first, whether we are. We first need to establish for sure that we are. So let's presume that we are. Then we would ask the question, why are we seeing that change? And ask the question, is it because, or let's put it like this. No, let's put it the way it was. Is it because actually we are very well informed, or we are very much better informed today than we were before? And based on the fact that we are very much better informed today than we were before, we just don't believe it. We can see that it can go, we can see that it's important, that bit, we agree. We can see that it will get us so far, and we want it to get us so far. But we understand that if we want to go further than that to, let's say, net zero, that we understand that that's going to cost us more in social terms than it's going to gain in environmental terms. And we understand that. And so it's not that we are against it. It's not that we have been against it in the past. It's not that it's a bad thing. It's not that we're uninformed. Actually, we are in favor of it. We are better informed now than we've ever been. We understand the implications, and we're saying this far and no further. Is it that? I'm just proposing that as a possibility that we need to reflect on. And to ask the question, is it a bad thing? In other words, have we already achieved enough? And already, is it enough for us to have 20% of the cars as electric vehicles? Is that enough? We might say yes. If everybody had an electric vehicle, would that be a good thing? No. Not particularly. Why? Because, well, first, we can't do it. We don't have the resources to make the batteries. But secondly, the carbon footprint of an electric vehicle is actually bigger than a hydrocarbon in terms of when you're making it total carbon. And then what would be the social implications of that? We're making electric vehicles, and what about the companies that are making the hydrogen? What about the readjustment. So it would be a question of what is the tolerable level, and are we approaching it, and are we near it? And that's really where we are, and that's, I think, a much more interesting space for academics to be looking at from a university perspective. And that's partly because I think that some of the companies are already at that space. They're already there, right? And I think the population in some instances are already there. They've already said, yes, it's clean enough. It's clean enough, it's quiet enough. We are using we're not using any paper, basically no paper, that's enough. And they're saying, I don't need to go further than what? Like the plastic straws, they don't, paper straws don't work. All right, so that's a bit of a history. I'll go a little bit quicker. Sorry if I reflected a little bit more on that first slide, but I think it's important for us to put it into context. Now, these are some of the motivations that are often used for ESG, and I have used these many times I've been advocating and training ESG and corporate responsibility since 2003, so 22 years, right, this year. And we always use similar motivations. We say, if you adopt ESG, it will attract investment and finance. If you adopt ESG or sustainability or corporate responsibility, it will reflect your values and give you a better purpose for your company. It will reduce your litigation risk. You are less likely to be fined or less likely to be sued. And that, some people say that's a rather negative thing, but well, negative or not, it's a reason. It will reduce your physical risk. What that means is, let's say for an institution, an organization, if you look after the environmental infrastructure, you're less likely to suffer from flooding, you're less likely to suffer from infrastructure breakdown. It will help your brand and reputation. It helps in terms of consumer protection and consumer reputation. And it helps in terms of talent, human resources. Looking after your people is one way of attracting good people, if you have a reputation for that. So these are often some of the things that we rehearse when we say, what are the benefits of environmental, social, and governance policies? What's the benefits of ESG, responsible management, sustainability? And if you look on the your right-hand side, you can see that actually this can just be reduced to a basic equation. And the basic equation is, it's actually a net present value type equation. It's just risk-adjusted returns. If you look at revenue, take away the cost, that's your profitability. If you then adjust that by the risk, then you can maximize your value added. Simple. From an economics perspective, that's what we would say. So you could say, I can increase my revenue by adopting ESG. How? Well, customers want it. If customers want it, they will buy the product from me. I can reduce my costs by adopting ESG. How? Well, if I reduce my electricity usage, I'm going to reduce my electricity bill. And that can be big, actually. You can reduce the electricity bills by 10, 20, 30%. It's a lot. So I can reduce my costs. If I raise my revenue and I reduce my costs, I can increase my profitability by adopting ESG programs. And then I'm less likely to be sued. So I reduce my risk. So I have a higher revenue, a lower cost, a bigger profit at lower risk. That's the outcome. And that's how, or certainly from an economics perspective, that's how I used to advocate it. That if you introduce these things into your management process, you get better management outcome. a better economic outcome. And this can help you build market share, for example, as well. These are some of the ways in which we motivate ESG. But over many years, and we'll see this later, I will show you some evidence to support this, but just to flag it. There is no systematic evidence that this is true. That's just it. Where you can show case studies where it's definitely true. Sure. We used to always use the Body Shop, right? And we used to say the Body Shop has a very fine and long-term sustainability and corporate responsibility brand, and it's very successful and it has survived. We use that type of case study. You can look at case studies and you can say for sure that you can identify benefits in individual companies, in industries, in particular markets. You can do that. You cannot show a systematic benefit for the economy as a whole. And that's evidence-based, and we'll see this later. And here's some evidence from the stock market. For this one, I will have to stand up. This has got the index, it's rebased from 2015, so nearly 10 years, of the indices on Bursa Malaysia. The first is the conventional index, the 100, and that's the red line. The sustainability index, which is the Bursa Malaysia FTSE Good, is the blue line. And the green line is the Islamic index. Now, the first thing to know is that there are some times when here the Islamic index underperforms and here the Islamic index overperforms. And the same is true of the conventional index and the ESG index. But there's no systematic overperformance of any of the either the Islamic index or the ESG index compared to the conventional. There's no systematic overperformance. In fact, this is the base of the index 100. All of them have been losing money for 10 years. All of them have been performing badly. Doesn't mean you can't make money investing in Bursa. You can. If you invest here and the price goes up, you can make money. But you have to be an active investor in the market and understand the information that's flowing through the market. Then you can make money from any one of these indices. You could put all of your money into the Sharia index and you could make a good return. And a good moral, ethically based return, because you know that these are screened. These are Sharia screened. You can do the same with the SRI or ESG screen. These are companies that have a good ESG performance. You can make money if you do that, but you can make just as much money by investing in a plain vanilla stock tracker. But if you look at the other panel, we're losing it a little bit, but it doesn't matter. These are the indices here from Bursa Malaysia. And this is the S&P 500, which is just a plain vanilla, ordinary, conventional stock. And if you put your money in that, you would have from 100 up to 225%. So you would have a massive return just on investing in plain vanilla American stocks. So this claim that ESG delivers a better financial performance is not supported. It's just simply not supported by evidence. There's some other evidence. These are two things that are often considered to be important in terms of ESG factors. One is diversity in the workplace. And there's an article here from the New York Times very recently, earlier this month. And we're seeing more and more of these articles. You would not have been able to publish an article like this just a few years ago, or just months ago, probably just months ago. Before November the 5th, you wouldn't have been able to get away with an article like this. And basically, they have looked at, this is called the SHE index. And this is an index where they look at gender diversity in the workplace and in the management of the company. And they take the stocks where there was a greater representation of women, right? They call that gender diversity, right? And they're showing that since 2020 to 2025, a 5-year period, companies where they have a higher representation of women perform very much worse. The gender diversity does not deliver a better financial outcome. Yeah. And they looked at the same with, I think they call it, what do they call it? iClean. The I shares global clean energy. So this is renewable energy, clean energy. Yeah. And again, they show that after the COVID period, I think that's 2020, right? So just around that period, there was a very sharp rise in clean energy stocks. Then there is a big collapse, actually, behind the indicator there, but it goes basically all of that gain was wiped out. And what this means, or what this suggests, is not that it's bad to have gender diversity in management. That it doesn't say that. That's not what it says. Nor does it say that it's bad to focus on clean energy. That's not what it says. What it says is there's nothing systematically better about these things in the long term in terms of financial returns and performance. In other words, yes, let's do it, but don't expect that you're going to get a premium from it. That's what it's saying. And because we can see these very long periods of evidence now, people are coming along and saying, yes, I like it, but it's not going to make me richer. It's not necessarily going to make me richer. Because if it did, everybody would be involved in that. And therefore, it's based on the evidence we are seeing a more objective evaluation. Now, this is the bit where you might want to step out, and if you're a delicate disposition, because this is the Global Compact, and this is the Malaysia and Brunei Global Compact Network, and they did something called the Malaysian Sustainability Pulse Report in 2022. And you can go online and you can see it. Okay. Now, this report was of, well, they did 2 reports. One was the general public, and the second was members of the Global Compact. The representatives, these are companies, right? So the representative companies. And they asked the person responsible for sustainability in the company the question. So these are people who know a lot about sustainability, and it's their job to deal with sustainability. And these are companies that are members of a sustainable company organization. Right? It's not a random stratified survey of the general population. It's specifically people who should be concerned about these issues. And 81% of the respondents said that they had no commitment at all to the Sustainable Development Goals, despite the fact they are members of the Malaysia-Brunei Global Compact. And either they had no commitment or that they were irrelevant to their business. Now, this is honest, at least. Okay, it might be, but to me, it's not shocking. To me, I understand this completely, because when I talk to companies, as a consultant to the companies, the first thing they tell me is this has got nothing to do with us, but I have to do it because somebody told me. The regulator told me I have to do it. Right? So here you have 81% saying they have no commitment or that it's irrelevant. Around 86% were not involved in sustainable finance. And a third of them said that sustainable finance was irrelevant to them. Around 95% of the corporates said they had no budget or no separate budget in their company for sustainability issues. And all of these said that they don't spend anything on what are called sustainability competencies, that is training their staff in sustainability issues. Like all of the 95% said they don't spend on staff training on sustainability issues. And then when we look at specific issues such as community development, diversity and discrimination, 64, 66 and 62 respectively, across, so that's 64 for community development, 66 for diversity and 62 for discrimination. Said that they haven't started to think about these things within their organization or that it's irrelevant. Yeah. In other words, they don't have to. But then, you know, if they ask me, when I was a provost of the MUST, if they ask me, are these things relevant? I would say, look at my staff, look at my students. Do you see diversity there? Yes. Do you see inclusion? Yes. 62% of all Malaysian students are women. There is no barrier. In fact, you could say we're discriminating against the boys. The problem is we need to look at why are the boys not coming? Right? These are the, but actually, broadly speaking, we would say, well, this is just in the past. It was the other way around. So these are just transition, and eventually it will work out. So that's why people would often say it's irrelevant, because they just see it in their environment. They say, look, I don't need to make a big fuss about this. I can just see it. Right? There's no sense of discrimination. We're just a grown-up group of people who respect each other, and we don't need to be told. So it could be that. Now, 1/3 said they adopt human rights practices, which means that 2/3 says that they don't, and 31% said that the human rights issues are irrelevant or that they do not understand them. Now, some people might say this is shocking, right? But if you're an accountancy company, what do you have to do with human rights? If you're a bank, you might have to deal with human rights if you're lending money to a company that is breaching human rights. Then you have an issue. Yes. But if you're a university, what are your issues on human rights? Well, we do research on human rights. Okay, that's about as relevant as it is to us. It's only in particular industries where these issues of human rights become what we call material. In plantations, for example, it's clearly material in plantations that people's human rights are at risk. Construction industry, they're at risk. But in many industries, there's no particular material concern for human rights. That's why they say that it's not relevant. It's not that they don't care. It's that it literally does not arise within the context or the sphere of our influence. And this is why I'm saying, actually, people do understand these issues. We understand completely, and we are able to say we understand it completely. It isn't appropriate or isn't relevant, it isn't material within the context or the scope of my organization. And that's not wrong. Actually, it's not wrong for them to do that. It's actually the mature way of thinking about it. And so there were 261 responses for this. So actually, perhaps it sounds alarming, but then when you step back and you reflect on it from the perspective of a more critical analytical approach, it's not that alarming. It's not that extraordinary. if you had a plantation company that said, I don't care about human rights, it's not, but then that is going to be alarming, right? But if you had an accountancy company that said, I don't care about human rights so much, that's less alarming, unless they're dealing with the accounts for plantation. Then that matters. Okay. Another dose of reality comes from this article. This is the same article. I only did that just to show that I run, and I do look as young as that, so that's all. That's fine. That's good. Is the question of energy transition. You know, we were talking about Brundtland report and the renewable energy. So there is an energy transition policy, and it aims to pivot Malaysia toward clean energy. Now, I made some economic observations, which I always do. I'm an economist, so how else would it be? The government says we're spending this amount of money, huge. Right. The first thing I always do is I divide it. Right. We're spending this amount of money. I divide it by the number of people. I get the per capita. Is it big or not? It's not big, right? I take the total amount of money, I divide it by GDP. What is the percentage of GDP? Is it big or not? That's what we do as economists. We don't care about 95 billion. 95 billion compared to what? Compared to 1.8 trillion economies. So when you do these sort of things, the number of jobs, for example, 207, and I thought that's a very precise number, a very precise, not 200, not 205,000, 207,000 exactly. And I thought, well, there are 2 million people who are underemployed, right? And they're only creating 207,000. So you have to compare it to the number of people. So, and that's over 18 years. That's 11,000 jobs per year, or 0.07% of the total labor force. The same as the contribution, 13 billion, or 0.8% of total GDP. But that's also spread over 7 years, right? So it's not that they're giving us 0.8% now, 0.8% spread over, that's what 0.1%, right? So that's not very big. That's within the margin of error. And actually, since the fiscal input is 4.3 billion and the investment input is 9.2 billion, they're spending more than they get back. Right? So we have to, as an economist, you would immediately say, what is the ROI? Well, actually, there is an ROI. The ROI is not disclosed in so much in it does make sense. The National Energy Transition Roadmap does make sense, and here's why. Because we have access to more renewable energy, the foreign data centers want to locate here because they suck up energy, massive amounts of energy. And their stakeholders care that this is clean energy. It matters. And so if we can provide clean energy, they will put their data center here rather than somewhere else where they're getting dirty energy, so to speak. Why don't they put it in Indonesia? Because in Indonesia, most of the energy is coal powered. Why do they put it in Malaysia? Because at least part of it can be renewable. And depending on the supplier, they could get all of their electricity from renewable clean sources, and then tell their investors in America and in Germany that it's clean, and the investors will love it. So it does matter. It matters a lot. And the same is true of the new cable from Sarawak to Singapore, right? Sarawak and Sarawak Energy is one of the largest producers of clean energy in the world, actually, because they have massive hydroelectric. Yeah. They don't sell it to Malaysians. They sell it to the Singaporeans. Why? Because it matters to the Singaporeans. Why? Because Singapore is a financial center. And the financial center uses a lot of data centers, number one. And the financial center in Singapore wants to attract the international clean energy funds. So that matters to them. So yes, it's true that this energy transition program will generate a very significant amount of extra energy and clean energy. But at the end of it all, 83% of Malaysia's energy used by Malaysian companies and Malaysian households will still come from hydrocarbons, not from renewables. So what is Malaysia's green premium, so to speak, on renewable energy? The Malaysians' green premium on renewable energy is selling it to somebody else. It's an export, in other words, rather than a domestic use. Do we need to draw some moral judgment about that? No, we are economists, we don't care, right? You produce it, you sell it. You sell it domestically or you sell it as an export, it doesn't matter. It's adding value. It's adding value, the economy is growing. If the economy is growing, the government has more revenue. If the government has more revenue, it can give more. Yeah. Right. So from an economics perspective, we don't have a moral judgment. But we need to understand that that's where the premium is coming from. And it's a good thing. The same would be true of the rare earths, the rare earth metals, right? That we were being told that Malaysia has rare earth metals equivalent to the total GDP of Malaysia. You have to dig it out of the ground, just like you have to suck out oil and gas. But is it worth doing that? Yes, if it gives you 1.8 trillion ringgit. Yes, it's worth doing that. Because with that 1.8 trillion ringgit, you could make a Malaysian super fund that would deliver 5% a year on that 1.8 trillion. And then every single person in Malaysia would have a guaranteed universal basic income for the rest of their life. That's the premium. That's the point. Someone else wants the rare earths for batteries. Malaysia has the rare earths for batteries. From an economics perspective, it's a resource. You sell the resource, you make the money, you invest the money for the social development, so the humane, sustainable economic development. Okay, I'll move a little quicker. Sorry, I'm taking a long time. All right. ESG and religion. We did some work in 2007 because we were interested in this, and we had access to a database which is called the World Values Survey, which you might be familiar with. And this had at that time 17,000 responses from individuals drawn from 20 different countries. And basically this asks people about their social values. What things do they find important? And it also asks about their demographics, their age, their gender, their education levels, and their religion. And it asks both what is your religion and the religiosity, how devout are you? Okay. And we thought this was very interesting because although the survey wasn't designed to connect together religious issues with CSR issues, it was possible for us to do that. Ex ante. So that's exactly what we did. And we basically found from the World Values Survey, the indicators of corporate social responsibility. How much do you care about the environment on a scale of 1 to 5? How much do you care about social issues? And quite a list. And then we asked a very straightforward question. Does your concern, for example, does your concern about the environment change, or is it different depending on which religion you have, which denomination? Or does it change depending on your level of devotion, your level of religiosity? And the second is, do members of different religions have different attitudes to CSR that conform to the general principles of that religion? Yeah, we ask these questions. questions, and the results were that broadly, religious individuals, that is, people who say, I am more devout, whatever is your religion, I am more devout, I am more faithful. They do not prioritize CSR issues above anybody else. So being religious does not make you more ESG oriented. Right? But they do have or hold a broader conception of social responsibility of businesses based on the teaching of the religion. And that's quite important because from an Islamic perspective, there is a very clear codification of how businesses should be run. Very, very clear. From a Christian perspective, it's not clear. We have basic principles, but we do not say you cannot have finance with riba. We do not say you have to have halal products. We do not say this. There are general principles. Don't rip people off, treat people nicely. We have those principles. So that matters. In other words, the codification matters. And once you have that codification, it causes clarification, and that clarification helps people to follow more responsible practices. And that's what we found, right? But we also found it wasn't true for all religious groups or for all areas of CSI. We found Buddhists, for example, were less concerned about these things because they also don't have a codified conception of how businesses should be run. So a whole different approach. We then did something specifically on Islam and CSR, which was to take the UN Global Compact. At that time, it was only 10 issues, or 8 issues, and to ask, is there any difference between these 10 secular statements of how companies should be and the basic principles, the basic tenets of Islamic business models, which you teach at this university, right, across all of your schools? And we found actually that there wasn't. There's no basic difference. In other words, what has been taught in Islam for 1400, 1500 years is already there. And what we see in CSR, or in this case, the representation of CSR through the Global Compact, is no more than a restatement of something that we've had for 1.5 millennia. Right? In other words, it's already ingrained in the teaching. Except this idea that corporation is a legal person. And that goes back to, strangely, there is a sort of link there between the Friedman approach. The Friedman would say that a corporation is a legal entity, there's no question about that. But he would not say that the corporation has a moral purpose, because it's a completely different type of, of course, it's a legal entity, but it's not a legal entity imbued with a moral purpose. No, it's the individual. And the same is true that, of course, in Islamic business and Sharia.
Sorry, I think the audience somebody might
Okay. All right.
Sri Mulyani mute.
Susah pelajarannya? Sri Mulyani pengrangkuman.
Can you mute your mind, everybody?
Pituk, jadi ini pituk. Kiri. Berani kan?
Tangan. Jai. Balik mana?
Mau langsung lihat ya?
Oh, here.
Okay, all right,
Sorry about
that's all right. So, in other words, we are able, and we were able to connect together the basic principles of Islamic business with corporate responsibility, and we come to the conclusion that actually, in that sense, clearly, corporate responsibility is not new. It's not as new as is claimed. And this is, I think, also quite important in the conversation that I was suggesting that we should continue to have, which is, if we see a growing skepticism, if we see that people are less concerned than they have been, is it necessarily a bad thing? If people are actually saying, you know what, I've come to understand what corporate social responsibility and ESG is all about, and I've come to understand that it's actually very similar to what we have had for 1,500 years. And having come to that conclusion, it doesn't make me any more skeptical about ESG and CSR. It doesn't make me any less of an advocate of that. It just makes me say, you know what, we sort of already have it. And short of some small things that we need to continue to be vigilant about and diligent about, we don't need to worry too much. And therefore, the claim of the skepticism and the change that we are seeing, or we appear to be seeing more recently, it's not that alarming. Yeah. And it's part of the natural discourse. Now, this is for academic institutions. I will leave this to you, actually, because we're running, I'm taking a lot of time, but I'll leave this to you. Sunway University have adopted a very significant sustainability infrastructure, and you can go to the website and there's a lot of information. And in particular, if you look at this, which is the Sustainable Development Goals, they have all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals, and you can click on it, and it will tell you what the university is doing. And it's very well developed. But when people ask me, what is it that academic institutions should be doing in terms of sustainability and these Sustainable Development Goals, my response every single time is simply build it into our curriculum. That's it. Whatever we do in the campus and all of this, these are additional things. At the core, we want to look at the quality education, number 4. Quality education, that is our core SDG. And perhaps number 17, which is partnerships for the goals. But at core, that's what we should be doing. That's what's material to us. And therefore, we can take an opportunity for every single one of our courses to build in awareness and alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals. And that, to me, is more than sufficient. It's more than sufficient. We cannot be changing the core material of an accounting course to take out how to do accounting techniques in order to put it in the 17 development goals. We can't do that. Right? We have to teach our core subject. But we can, in an accounting course, say, well, how can we use accounting to help companies measure their carbon footprint? And that would just be changed in terms of the case study. And it can be done very simply. Accountants use the electricity bill of every company. You know what is the electricity bill in ringgit. You know what is the electricity bill in kilowatt hours. You can convert that into carbon. And you can do that in an Excel file very simply. And you can tell the company, this is your carbon footprint. And then you can help them to reduce it. That's a simple case that can be introduced into accountancy course without changing the overall content of the accountancy course. And it will be very powerful, because what that does is to help to inculcate into the DNA of our programs the basic principles that we're aiming to achieve. So my view is, whenever I'm asked, what should universities do? It's integrate it into the curriculum. And here we've got a list, and you can share these slides, by the way, which you can all have them. This is a list of free courses from the United Nations on the Sustainable Development Program, the Sustainable Development Goals. You can pick it up without having to use AI. It's already there, right? Now, this is fine. This is the final slide, which is, what is the future of ESG? And as academics, what is our role? Well, we will have to see what our role is, but we can see how our role as academics has changed. This is an article, it's the same article that was in the Wall Street Journal. And it shows an interesting study of academic papers published from 2011 until most recently, the first couple of months of 2025. And it shows whether these papers were positive on ESG, neutral on ESG, or negative on ESG. And it shows that before 2021, actually in 2017 to 2020, every paper that was published was positive. And before that, most of the papers were positive, and part of them, if they weren't positive, they were neutral. But then after 2022, you start to see more evidence which is not positive, it's negative, which is to say it is, well, a bit like that diversity indicator, which says the diversity actually caused a reduction in performance. And you see more of that after 2022, 2023, and 2024. A very large number were negative. And recently it's a little more balanced, but it's a very small number. And what that's saying is, this is not to say that these papers are actively campaigning against ESG. They're not actively campaigning against, they are objective studies. And it's also, one has to, excuse me, one has to ask, is it a change in mindset, or is it just a change in evidence? That is to say, in 2011, we didn't really have very much evidence. So it was much more conceptual. You would see more conceptual papers, more theoretical papers, more papers which says it should be like this. We would expect it to be like this. And as time has gone on, we are seeing more evidence-based case studies. We have more time series in terms of financial indicators, for example. And we can see that because of the accumulation of evidence, it would be more likely to see negative or not positive papers. So again, we have to be balanced about that. It's not to say that the academic community is becoming anti-ESG. It's not true, right? In fact, we are more likely to advocate. We're more likely to write papers on sustainability now than ever before, because it is much more relevant, topical. But the more papers we write, the more chance we will see non-positive outcomes. And what is our job as academics? Our job as academics is to interpret that in a balanced way. And if we can view it in a balanced way and interpret it in a balanced way, then that will give us some ideas of how we can continue it in the future.
Right, thank you very much, Dr. Jeffrey Williams. One thing's for sure from this session is Dr. Jeffrey was very worried whether he could speak for 1 hour. I think he easily crossed that threshold. I think he could even do 3 with these slides. But I thought it was very informative because he kind of gave us the whole evolution until where we are right now. And we get an idea of what the current trends are like and what future trends could look like. And more specifically, he gave us an idea of the role we as academicians must play. I'm in agreement for the most part with what has been said. But I think at the core of it all, I think maybe human beings are not fully aware of the full spectrum of well-being yet, perhaps. And so I wouldn't probably blame it on corporations or institutions per se, but maybe the human condition itself and how we conceive what is well-being and what it means to be complete. So that's where I'll leave it as the moderator. We're going to open the floor to questions. Remember that this we'll take maybe about a few questions from the floor, and let's allot about 10 to 15 minutes for this, and then maybe we can move to our discussant, Prof. Afifi, and his comments of what are the implications of Dr. Jeffrey Williams' ideas and notions in terms of from a more general perspective, and maybe specific stakeholders as well. So when maybe posing a question, you might want to introduce yourself, what you're doing at the moment, what is your current role, and keep the question clear and concise so as not to confuse us here on the floor, because we are the ones on camera, and yeah, and so that everyone can keep adrift with what's being the discussions, the ongoing discussion. So that's basically my request. So perhaps I'll take some questions from the floor right now, and then maybe I'm supposed to have a media person here, or usually I'm used to having one. So I'll focus more right now on the floor right now, and I'll try and keep an eye on the Zoom chat as well. Okay, so anyone, we're looking at things related to ESG, of course, as well as the sustainable and humane economy. So yeah. Razul, maybe you're close to the camera, hopefully you can hear. We can, yeah.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Dr. Raisat, first I would like to ask the first question. With regard, you mentioned earlier, Prof, the understanding of the companies that it's important not only to make profit and also have to take consideration other things like the environment. But that was not the earlier approach. Right now it become more apparent that the companies should also take into consideration the environment, the social and the government aspects. So do you think that this is the step forward that we have to sell or educate our students and companies that ESG must take place, that because it has benefit a long term to the company? I think this is very critical, otherwise we don't know where we're going.
Can you hear me if I don't use the mic?
I think so.
Okay. I'm trying to think about the answer to that. I would say that instinctively, academics would teach students to be ethical. Instinctively, that is, broadly speaking, that's who we are as people. So within the university, that's actually what we stand for. Every university has that as a core value. But we are often given this view that when people move into the world of work, so to speak, or particularly into corporate activity, and particularly into particular types of corporate activity, if they're going to move into finance, for example, that we expect them to be different. If they move into finance, we expect them not to care about moral issues, just to make $1 from a cent, right? But we don't teach that in universities, right? They sort of learn that, or they instinctively have that from somewhere, and they've retained it despite our best efforts, and then they go into the world of work. And so the question arises: what should we do as universities, as academics? Well, we must always be consistent with our core values, And so if we are teaching in management, strategy, business, marketing, human resource management, we should not be encouraged. For example, let's say we're teaching human resource management. We should not be encouraged to give a lecture on how to treat your employees badly. Right? How to protect your company when you're sued for wrongful employment practices. We should not be teaching that, right? We should be teaching, that's what they learn when they go to bar school. Right? What we should be teaching is how to treat people well in the workplace. Because that's a core value of what we do. That's a core value of what we do. But then we must always say, why should you treat people well? Well, because intrinsically, it's just a good thing, right? But the evidence tells you that if you treat them well, you get a better outcome. And that's the issue, right? So that's what we have to try to, from a university perspective, management school perspective. That's why we have to teach this. And it's changed actually in management schools. In the past, it used to be how to make as much money as possible from running your company. That's what it used to be. Now it's much more how to run a company properly. But we're pushing too far. And the evidence, I think, is rather clearer on this now. That's why we're seeing perhaps more of these negative papers here. Where if we say we push too much on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or we push too much on environment, social, and governance issues, then we are taking our sight off the core aim of a company, which is to continue to run as a corporate enterprise. So it's a question of balance, and who is better at encouraging people to take a balanced view than academics? Because that's what we do. We hope. We hope that that's what we do, and that's what we should be encouraging with our students. So my answer is, from a university perspective, we must stick to our core values.
Okay, okay, there's a question, right? See the hand raised in the chat, so I'm going to get I'll give you a chance to ask the question.
Thank you, Doctor. So my question is actually regarding this graph. So like for the negative portion, is there any relation between COVID with this negative portion of the graph? Like the COVID was started in 2022 or 2020. And relation?
Well, it might be. That's what we have to try to understand, because as I mentioned, where we have more evidence, and particularly where we have more evidence in the context of extraordinary events like COVID, then we are able to test, like a stress test. How successful is ESG in a situation of crisis? It might be that. So I think that is an interesting observation that we make, because as academics, we have to say it's not the ESG itself. It's that, well, my proposition was we have more evidence. That's of course, but your proposition is it's not the ESG itself. It's because there was something else extraneous.
Because on that time, business were naturally down on those years.
Yes. So the question would be, during the COVID period, companies needed to really focus on keeping their people in work, paying the people's salary, keeping the company going, and this is purely commercial. And it might be that, well, if companies were not focused on that, but instead were still focused on environmental, social, governance, diversity, equity, and inclusion,
Mm.
that actually was not helping them in terms of the resilience. And therefore, the performance of those companies was less good than the performance of companies which said, forget everything else, keep the company going, at least for the next year or so. After that, we can go back. So it might be that, yes. I don't know is the answer, but it might be. And that would be certainly a testable proposition with them.
You are. Your name and
Oh, yeah, my name is Mahbub Humane, doing master's from PICT.
KIC. Okay. We have another question from the person next to you, maybe. Good. Melina, I'll get to you soon. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. William. My name is Hamdi Nasser. I'm master's degree fully of accounting. I'm doing now research for sustainability reporting in Malaysia. So you have mentioned it that some factors motivate ESG. Do you think that capital market and regulatory distribution motivate companies to ESG disclosure and ESG programs positively or negatively? Thank you.
Okay, what I think is that the capital market bursar in particular, and the Securities Commission and the Securities Industry Development Corporation, as IBC, are developing a very robust, very strong infrastructure, including the new guidelines on sustainability reporting framework. So certainly the infrastructure is there, and that is supported by awareness campaigns and by training campaigns. The question arises, is this causing a change actually in the way that companies are actually managed? Or is it just a change in the way that they are reporting the claims as to how they're managed? And we don't particularly have the evidence on that. My experience of sustainability reporting, which goes back to 2003, 2006, I think was the first one. And it's the same experience of every company. If you give me a set of criteria, environment, social, and governance, I will be doing something in all of those areas, which is good. For sure, I will. And so I can make my data fit. I can push it and I make it fit and move it around a little bit. Tuck it in here and put it out there. I can do all of that, right? But what I'm doing is I'm running the company in exactly the same way as I ever did. But all I'm doing is changing the way I'm reporting the running of the company. And actually, I'm complying to the reporting, and I'm doing well in the compliance to the reporting. But actually, behind the scenes, nothing changed. And that's the real concern, that we do have a lot of guidelines, mandatory guidelines for some companies, and then training and infrastructure and information, and consultants, all sorts, right? But that doesn't mean that the companies change actually what they do. I did the sustainability reports for most of the GLCs actually, and I can tell you in my experience, without pointing to a single, this one or that one or that one, basically none of the GLCs changed their management at all. They didn't change the management at all. They just changed the reporting. And actually they spent more on the graphic design than they spent on the consultant to write it. And once they'd spent the money on a consultant to write the report for 2 or 3 years, they stopped with the consultant and they just updated it year on year. There's nothing changing. So we are getting an improvement in disclosure, but it doesn't necessarily translate into change in management. That answers.
Good example, because when you hire the consultant, you are spending in line with ESG.
Yes, just hiring a consultant.
All right, we have an online question as well. So Amalia, you may unmute yourself and ask your question. And turn your video on if you want.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Gurufri and Dr. Yaset. Apologies. First, it seems that you mentioned halal in your speech, and I'm interested in that. I want to ask two questions. For first, is how does the halal market contribute to economic growth while adhering to ESG principle? And the second is, what challenges do companies face in integrating halal practices within their ESG strategies? Thank you.
So the halal market is huge. Isn't it? Isn't it $4 trillion? That's product, halal product market. And the Islamic finance market is also huge. It's also about 2 trillion something like that. Now, in order to be halal compliant, you need to have some form of halal certification. But actually, formally, you shouldn't have to. Formally, you shouldn't have to, because you shouldn't need a certifier to tell you that you're a good Muslim. So you should just do it. Okay, but in order to signal to the market, signal to the customer, you have to have the certificate. The certificates for halal certification at the moment focus purely on the halal guideline, and they don't necessarily have wider considerations for environmental impact and so on. So a product could be completely halal in terms of how it's produced, the factory, everything, but is not necessarily minimizing its environmental impact because there's not a criterion. Okay. So there is overlap. There is some overlap, but it's not a complete overlap. And actually, we don't, as far as I understand it, have a green halal certificate, which would say, yes, it's halal, and it's also environmentally sustainable. But we also have no evidence that consumers care about that in particular. There's no, provided it's halal, for most people, that's enough. It's halal and it's good value for money. That's only good. And so the answer is that there is an overlap, but we don't have much development of that. It doesn't appear to me much development of that industry or the certification of that industry. But there is a huge market for it. Yeah, a huge market in terms of 1.4 billion Muslims and then trillions of dollars in certified products.
So in your experience, would you say that, let's say if the halal market were to go for green or mapping their products according to some green criteria, would you say that would open up the halal market to a wider audience, perhaps the Europeans who are?
Yes, it could, in principle, it could. Because clearly, for Muslims, the fact that the product is halal is essential. For non-Muslims, it's not essential, but it's good. I mean, non-Muslims are not going to say, I'm not going to eat it because it's halal. They're not going to say that, right? So they will say, it's halal and I'm going to eat it. And, yes, and it is. And if you were to say, it's also compliant to various sustainability indicators, then that would be a good thing. Yeah. But I mean, I think the point is that there is no inconsistency between the two approaches. And in fact, there is a very strong overlap, as we showed with the overlap with the Global Compact. You could, in principle, look at all of the Sustainable Development Goals and do the same exercise that we did. Then it was only 10. Now it's 17 with all of them altogether. But you can, in principle, do the same thing and just say, yes, consistent, no conflict. And that's really what's very important. There is no conflict between what is being asked from a sustainability perspective and what is being asked from a Sharia perspective. There is no conflict.
If we have another question from Dr. Ahmed.
I'm not from economics and from business department. It's very interesting about when you highlight about the evidence that it shows that we can see that there's a negative and there's a from the reports that now people are more neutral. My question is it when you mentioned about the firm, it's very important for us to instill the awareness and the responsibility to each individual in the organizations instead of we are introducing many terms, yet people are not really fully understand the term, and then they disassociate with the terms,
Yeah.
for example, like ESG, even Sharia compliance, but actually there are implements the values. So there's another critical question: is it are we what we should focus during these 10 years, 20 years? Are we focusing on something that really not really comprehend, fully comprehend, provide the comprehensive understanding to the students, even to the market people, what actually they need to do as an individual, leader, manager, employees, and stakeholders?
Okay, so I think that that's an important question to ask because it's about the agenda, what do we need to do? And I think that you're right about the different use of terms leads to confusion. And then that confusion leads people to think, well, what should I be doing? So from a positive perspective, you should just try to clarify the confusion, clarify the terms, and show actually that there is no difference. We are not talking about different issues. Right? When we talk about CSR, we are basically talking about ESG. We're basically talking about sustainability. There may be a difference in the prioritization of the E and S and G, but basically the core content is the same. So we can do that and we can clarify that. But I think there is also something that I'm observing, and it's just anecdotal, but I think actually the more I see it, well, now that I know of it, I spot it more often. And that is a direct cynicism, where we mentioned that the change is becoming cynical. And that is where people deliberately confuse the terms because they don't want the agenda to move forward. Yeah, they say, oh, no, this is different to what you were telling me before. Oh, no, we are doing that, but it's not the same. I have to, and then they will say, look, I have to invest too much because you want me to do CSR and you want me to do ESG. And then you will tell me I want me to do sustainability. And I'm investing 3 times. You're not investing 3 times. It's the same thing. So there is that. There is a deliberate attempt to confuse. And there's something else which is very important, which I think is a very important area of potential research, particularly associated with this. You remember I mentioned litigation risk. And that was one of the things that I used to constantly advocate as one of the main reasons why you should get involved in this, because of the reduction in litigation risk. And that was at a time in the past when we used to talk about enterprise risk management, right? ERM, market. And the basic principle of that was, I will identify the risk, I will try to remove it. Right? That's what you do. But now we have something called resilience management. And resilience management is, I know there's a risk, but I'm not going to remove it because I'm never going to be sued. And if I am, I have a big lawyer. And my lawyer is going to protect me and I'm going to get through it. And that's a complete antithesis. So they're basically saying, how can I avoid the risk of the ESG risk by hiring a lawyer to stop it from happening? So if you know that a product is dangerous and you want to put that into the newspapers or public domain, they will sue you. They will stop you from putting it there. If there is an environmental disaster at a company, the first thing they will do is not to fix the environmental issue, is to sue the whistleblower. And that's a dangerous pushback. And that's something I think that we need to take into account, which is our job is to clarify, just to summarize, to clarify these differences of terms. That's our job as academics. But we also have to recognize that sometimes these differences are malicious, deliberate. And we have to address this issue of resilience management from a business perspective. Does it exist? Is it the right way? What are the risks? What are the benefits? What are the costs? From an accounting perspective, right? You might say it's not material from an accounting perspective. It's only worth, a fine was 1,000 ringgit or 10,000 ringgit in a billion ringgit company. Okay. And the question of materiality, does it matter? For example, is something we need to think about from an academic perspective. And that's important. That's an important area of research.
Hi, my name is Intan from Department of Economics. I have a simple question. What's your opinion? Because now we have Donald Trump presidency. So what's your opinion on the future ESG with his policies? Because his policies, let's say for environment, the climate change, this is the second time US government withdraw from Paris Agreement, for instance. And also for his policies also more towards in favor of fossil fuels. And in terms of diversity, inclusivity, and equity, his policies is more on like to provoke the companies to withdraw from or to eliminate the this what's that, inclusivity and equity policies. So what's your opinion on this?
Okay, so on diversity, equity, and inclusion, without going too deeply into it, I would just make the observation that these companies, big major companies that had diversity, equity, and inclusion at the core of their so-called corporate values, abandoned it overnight. They made no fight. They just said, good, thank you.
No cost.
Don't need to do that anymore. Save the costs. Don't care. So you can criticize, if you like, Donald Trump for this, but actually it goes back to the question, isn't it? It's not the regulator, it's the company. What does the company care about? Left to their own devices, they wouldn't do it. Before, they weren't left to their own devices, they were being pushed to do it. Now, he says it's not necessary, they abandon it. He is not saying you cannot do it. Because if you're a company, you want that, you can still do it, but they've abandoned it. And that means that it was not genuine in the first place. It was not an authentic core component of what they were doing.
So would you see that he's a kind of risk to ESG or something like that?
I think that from his perspective, he is not, it's not that he's sort of against it. For him, it's just irrelevant. And what he is against is people pushing that agenda at the expense of other things.
But does it mean that because he is a businessman, isn't it?
Yes, he wouldn't have it in his business.
Yeah, so
That's the point.
he's more towards profit maximization. Yes. That's what you mean. So don't you think that there's no balance between this, profit maximization and ESG? Then if he goes towards that, do you think
there is no evidence that is compelling, which said there is some evidence, but it's not compelling evidence. There is no compelling evidence to suggest that diversity, equity, and inclusion improves the performance of companies. In fact, the evidence is often the opposite.
So it's not something like a very interesting agenda for
No,
people like
it's an
this.
irrelevant agenda.
Yeah.
This is the issue. That's the point. But the other thing that you mentioned about the
Environment.
environment, again, you have to look at the evidence that many decades of environmental policies have not reduced the rate of global warming.
Mm.
They haven't. So what is the effect of those policies? Well, the effect of those policies has been to increase corporate costs. And that increase in corporate costs has had social impacts. So in a sense, it's a matter of saying, sort of, stop that. Let us get on with it. Whatever are the problems, we fix it afterwards. I mean, you have to make that basic observation. Decades of environmental regulation has not improved the rate of global warming. It hasn't. So are those policies working or not? And his view was, is they don't work and they cost a great deal. So on a balance of costs and benefits, better we don't know. That's his view.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Jeffrey. We'll have time for maybe one more question. So I think.
Hi, my name is Sakina. I'm a graduate student here. I was wondering, okay, you presented on the motivation indicators by presenting on the SHE index and essentially the stock market. I was wondering if you could, maybe we could view this from a completely different story, a completely different area, which could be telling us a completely different story. And the second question, you personally as an academic, do you agree to these two being the main indicators to the motivation of ESG?
Which two?
The SHE index and the stock market.
No, well, firstly, I was just trying to find evidence, systematic evidence. Okay, that's the issue. I can look at particular cases and I can say it works in particular cases, but systematically, but and over a long period. That's all. I'm not suggesting that it's never true. That would be wrong, because it is sometimes true. In terms of the SHE index, this is a question of gender diversity. And I'm not against gender diversity at all. In fact, I'm not against having 100% women on a board. I don't care. Right? I went to a college in Cambridge, was 100% women's college. Not when I was there. They changed it in 1979, but it was for more than 100 years, 120 years, 100% women's college. I have no problems with 100% male universities, 100% female universities. I have no problems with any of those things, right? But the issue is that diversity and the evidence of diversity is not about gender. It's about diversity of mindset. If you had a board of directors made up of 10 women, all of whom were stupid, then the company would perform badly. If you had 10 men, all of them were stupid, the company would perform badly. The gender doesn't matter. If you had 10 people on a board, they are all accountants. Nobody deals with operations or anything else, or human resources, or that company will fail. Right? It's a question of diversity of expertise, diversity of qualification, diversity of outlook, age, and the evidence for diversity in teams that it improves performance is very strong. It's very, very strong. Yeah, and the reason for that is when people have different views and different perspectives for any issue, they will debate it and get to the right answer. But where people have the same mindset, where irrespective of their gender, doesn't matter, they have the same mindset, they don't debate the issue with the same complexity. So they will be more likely to accept the conventional wisdom. And that means that they're more likely to make mistakes because they haven't tested the idea. So the question of diversity is about not about demographics. It's not about gender, age, ethnicity. That's not the issue. That doesn't help you at all. It's about, well, certainly in a business perspective, in a business context, it's about diversity of experience and diversity of qualifications, diversity of approach, and allowing freedom of expression within the group. That's inclusion. Including people who have a different view. You know, there's the joke, we believe in inclusion in this company, and if you disagree, we're going to exclude you. That's the issue. Nobody is against diversity, equity, and inclusion. Nobody, even Donald Trump, is not against diversity, equity, and inclusion. He isn't. Look at his cabinet. It's very diverse. It's very equitable. It's very inclusive. It's just he has a different perspective on what those dimensions of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right, thank you for that last question and your response, Dr. Jeffrey. Will move on to the next part of our discussion series. So with that light, I would like to introduce our esteemed Professor Dr. Mansur Afifi, who's our discussant for this session, and he'll be talking about the relevance of what we've been discussing all this time in a general sense. So a little more about Professor Afifi. He is a distinguished professor at Universitas Mataram, UNRAM, Indonesia, specializing in economics, banking, and finance. His research focuses on economic policy, regional development, and environmental sustainability, particularly in the evaluation of natural resources and the impact of economic changes on local communities. Professor Afifi has contributed to numerous academic publications and policy discussions, addressing issues such as sustainable tourism, economic resilience, and the role of financial institutions in economic growth. His expertise has been instrumental in shaping policies for sustainable development, especially in Indonesia. Beyond academia, he has actively engaged in research and consultancy, providing valuable insights into economic recovery strategies, particularly in disaster-affected regions. His work continues to influence scholars, policymakers, and practitioners in the field of economics and sustainable development. So without any further ado, I would like to invite Professor Afifi to unmute and continue the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Yasat Amin. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. First of all, I would like to express my thanks to IIUM for giving me the opportunity to participate in the CIE Intellectual Discourse Series 2025. It is a pleasure for me to be able to contribute to the event. Besides, my thanks goes to Mr. William for his excellent presentation on the very interesting topic, since we love our planet, our environment, and our habitats. In this occasion, I would like to convey several comments on the presentation and question as well, especially as academicians and researchers. In general, Mr. William, the presentation provides a broad overview of ESG, touching on its evolution, corporate motivation, intersection with religions, the reality of ESG adoption, particularly in Malaysia, role in academic institution, and future direction. Here's some key comments as academicians and researchers. First of all, the presentation highlights confirmation bias in ESG research, where many studies claim ESG leads to better financial performance. This calls for more critical and balanced research. Secondly, ESG is becoming more interdisciplinary, integrating economics, business ethics, environmental science, and even religion. And this requires university to rethink how they teach sustainability. Finally, ESG education is often seen as theoretical. Therefore, more real-world case studies and collaboration with business could bridge the gap between academia and industry. Here's some discussion question. I have 6 questions, Mr. William. First question is, how can ESG research remain unbiased, avoiding the tendency to overstate its benefits? Since the common question arises is that, does ESG inventing truly lead to better financial performance, or does it depend on the sector and regions? Second question is, should ESG be integrated into all business and economics curricula, or should it remain a specialized area? The third question is, how can university mix ESG education more practical and industry relevant? The fourth question is, given the ESG performance metrics vary widely, how can researchers standardize ESG measurements methodologies? And the fifth question is, how can Islamic financial principle contribute to the global ESG conservation? Could you please specify the principle and how is the chance those principles to be accepted in this current situation in which Islamophobia is flourishing? Lastly, given the report's finding that 81% of businesses in Malaysia see SDGs as irrelevant, what practical incentives could increase corporate ESG adoption? Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay. I'm not sure I can remember all 6, but I can remember some of them. But you made notes, right? So you can.
My question would be confirmation bias.
Okay, the first question was confirmation bias, and I think the answer to that question, which is how can we do our best to avoid confirmation bias? The answer to that question must be by applying standard methodology. Confirmation bias is not unique to ESG. Confirmation bias can arise in any form of research, right? And for those of you who are not perhaps familiar with what we mean by that, what that means is I have a proposition and I try to find the evidence to prove that proposition. And I ignore evidence that disproves that proposition. And that leads to a confirmation bias, because I'm only looking at the evidence that gives me the outcome that I want. So we have methods in all social sciences, both quantitative and qualitative methods, and just on basic research methodology and research philosophy, that tell us that we must be balanced in looking at the data, whatever the data might be, and that the design of the research must be done in a way that allows positive and negative results as an outcome. Yeah. But I think before we do that, we must also remember that we are academics, not advocates. This is an agenda that is built from an advocacy perspective. And I make no judgments about that. People are completely free to advocate whatever position that they want. So if someone is advocating, we have to take that on face value, not adopt it. We have to say your proposition is a falsifiable proposition. It's falsifiable on the evidence. And our methods allow us to falsify it. And if it isn't falsified, your proposition stays until such time as it's false. And if it can never be falsified, then we put confidence in that proposition. But it's not our job as academics to be advocates. What was the second question?
How to integrate it into
Okay.
all areas where the
Okay, so the second question is, should we integrate it into all areas and how, or should we deal with it separately? My view is we integrate it. This is my preference. And one of the reasons for that is I have seen many programs, MSc in sustainability, Bachelor in corporate responsibility, and nobody wants to take those programs because they're too specialist. And they feel that they can't get a job because of that. And that's perfectly reasonable. That's just the evidence that we see. Right? Whereas I feel that it's perfectly possible and interesting for us to use case studies in all of our subjects, which are sustainability focused and which are quite natural for us. In the economics field, we talk about the tragedy of the commons. It's a normal thing, right? It's actually core to what we talk about. And all we need to do is to connect that to the sustainability, the current sustainability agenda. It's actually common. It's a common thing. And I think that to integrate it both, it has the advantage of making sure that we are drawing a connection with the Sustainable Development Goals, but also it's interesting for our subject material. We're changing the subject material, including case studies on this. Yeah. What was the third one?
making education relevant.
Okay, the education relevance issue, I think, is also that that it's integrated, that it is relevant, and that it's interesting.
The next one is how to standardize ESG. Because different industries have different standards.
Oh, yes, okay. So this issue of standardization was very difficult. And we used to have different standards for different industries. We had, for example, the Marine Stewardship Council, and then we had the Forest Stewardship Council for, obviously, for forestry and maritime. And then we had some for financial sector. Banks had a different standards. Construction companies had a different standard. And the Global Reporting Initiative was the general standard, but they then had special sectors or sections that you would have to put in. For example, if you're a construction company, you had a bigger carbon footprint, so you had different criteria. And actually, that becomes incredibly complicated. And then people just say, I don't want to do it because it's too expensive. The simplest way of doing it is to apply the principle of materiality. The principle of materiality is to have a very long list of indicators. So 17 Sustainable Development Goals, each one's got 100, something, whatever it is, it's 1700. And then to go through and ask the question, is it important for my company? Is it important for my company's stakeholders? And if it's not important for your company, it's not material. If it's not important to your stakeholders, it's not material. If it's important both for your company and your stakeholders, it's highly material, you should report. And it's the materiality principle that determines whether, not the standard itself, the materiality principle determines what is important. That's how you deal with good ESG management. Not by trying to tick every box, because that's impossible. It's to say, these are the things that are important, and we do our best in these areas. And if we don't, then we have a problem. But if we do, then we are fulfilling our responsibility to our stakeholders, and that's our fundamental responsibility.
This applies to, like, let's say, all industries, and
Yes.
this is an all comprehensive list
Yes.
of.
So, for example, for a university, we have to conform to the quality education. And we would also have to have some significant concerns about access and equality. And access is an equality. There's a gender SDG and there's an equality SDG. And they have different, one is about equality in terms of income group, for example, ethnicity, location, all of this. These are clearly concerns to us as a university, for sure. And quality education is clearly something that is important to us. There's no question about that. But life in the ocean is probably not important to us. But then if we have a school of environmental sciences, then it would be or could be. Yeah. So we would have to make a decision about that. I mean, when I was at MUST, we're in the middle of Kota Damansara. There's no maritime around, but we have a very big school on transport and logistics. And at the core of transport and logistics, particularly maritime logistics, are these issues. So for us, actually, strangely, it was material. Not that we ourselves in our operations and products were involved in that, but in our teaching, we were involved in it. So it's an individual basis. It's all done on an individual basis.
I think also standardization may extend to relationships between different areas. For example, using your example, let's say that you're not connected to maritime, certainly not directly, but you may be strongly influencing another connected industry. Let's say, for example, transportation is one. However, food systems, maritime food systems is definitely something that's core to all of us. So how do we make it so integrated? Because right now it's fragmented, and we know on the one hand, we want to educate people in an integrated way.
Yeah.
But however, when we move to the industry, we're kind of taught to look at things in a fragmented way. So how do we do it such that we're able to stitch these different narratives together so that we can achieve something bigger?
Well, this is what we are good at as academics, is to connect these dots. And we should be able to identify that these are issues that are material, they're important, that you need to know these things as part of a comprehensive course content. Yeah. For example, we talk about halal products, but we also need to talk about halal logistics. The product itself is halal, but when you transported it and it's in a container next to something that's not halal, for example, and what that means is that suddenly that's connected to logistics. And we need to be able to draw those connections together. And that's our job as academics, and we're good at that. And we do that in a disinterested way. We step back and we say, well, actually, we're doing this in a systemic way. And we have no particular interest to advocate. We just say it's important in that context.
Fifth question was related to, well, it's sort of like how, when we look at, let's say, SDG and ESG principles from a conventional perspective, like you were saying, perhaps the Europeans may focus more on the environmental aspect, whereas Asians would look at the human or social development side of it more. So in that light, maybe what can, Prof. Afifi's question is sort of like, what can Islamic financial principles contribute to the ESG framework? And how can we get buy-ins into that kind of framework?
Okay, so we discussed this quite a lot, actually, particularly in the training programs in the Middle East. And for me, one of the main ways in which this is important is that Islamic finance is so much better at managing risk. Because it's a core, actually, isn't it? In the sense that In conventional finance, it's this. I give you the loan. The interest rate goes up and down according to the market. You carry the risk. You bear the risk. Yeah. Now, the argument for that is, well, if I have the loan, that puts the responsibility on me. I must then act responsibly in order to make sure I can fulfill the obligations of the loan. But we all know that there are things that happen completely outside of your control. Nothing that you can do. In conventional finance, the borrower carries all of that risk, 100%. And this is where we saw the crisis, the mortgage crisis in the United States. You know, you take out a loan, the economy crashes, you can't afford to pay your mortgage, they take back your house, right? And then you have this massive crisis. That would not happen in an Islamic finance perspective, because until you pay the loan, both the borrower and the lender have joint property of the house, yeah, and therefore it deals much more effectively with the entire control and management of risk. Yeah, that comes, of course, from a moral perspective, originates in a moral perspective, but that moral perspective has required various forms of contract, and various forms of regulation, and various forms of procedures, which deliver a codification which is very, very much better. And therefore, that can be that's a very good way of advocating Islamic principles from a responsibility perspective. And where does that fit in ESG? It's a governance issue, as well as a social issue, but primarily it's a governance issue. It's the governance of the contract and the balance of the risk and how would it be enforced. So it's a very good governance contribution.
Well, I would agree. I mean, certainly, if you look at Islamic finance, we have more parties involved than the conventional. However, that also, it's a learning curve, because that also gives birth to now more unique risks which are associated with Islamic finance as well. So on the one hand, yes, parties are more interrelated, but on the other hand, because we have more contracts, we have additional risks which are also unique to Islamic finance. So I think there's a lot to look into this area and unpack. All right. Okay. Professor Afifi, I don't think I collected your last question somehow. You could repeat that.
Okay. My last question, maybe? Yes.
Yes, I missed that one.
Okay. Given the report's findings that 81% of businesses see ESG as irrelevant, what practical incentives could increase corporate to adopt ESG?
Right. Thank you, Professor Afifi. I think we got that.
Okay, so the first question is to ask whether that is a problem or not. Because as I mentioned before, it may be 81% said it's not relevant because it actually isn't. And it's not, you cannot necessarily interpret that as saying I am anti-ESG. It is literally my business does not involve that activity and is never going to. So the first question is to establish whether or not it matters. So in terms of the incentives, the incentive might be for the government. I suppose I'm not a government interventionist. Absolutely no, not at all. So just leave it at that. That's a completely different topic. But if the government were to introduce some incentive, it would be to have companies justify why they say that. And if a company can justify it by saying we did an analysis and we have found that it's not relevant, then there is no issue there. But if the companies are simply saying, oh, you know, I'm telling you it's irrelevant, but really it's because I don't want to do it. It is actually relevant, but I don't want to do it. Then there's something wrong there. So that's a question of you have to do the analysis or you be penalized. Or we give you an incentive to do it. The incentive is don't be penalized.
Thank you.
It comes maybe some of the institutional or maybe the incentives related to the ESG frameworks, maybe those aren't flushed out sufficiently or are not present, so to speak, at all. Professor Afifi, anything you would like to add after Dr. Jeffrey's comments, response?
Yes, I think yeah, because we as a researcher has freedom to propose our to make a proposition, and then that is our responsibility to verify that in a very honest manner. So that is the, I think I agree with that, and because that is the creed of our as academician. Thank you for the explanation.
Thank you very much for your questions. I think they were very helpful.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Afifi. I think one thing that becomes very clear that we've been skirting around for a while is that academicians, we have a more adventurous role and a more defining role in what ESGs actually are and what the framework should look like. But the problem is how we interface with the industry. And I think that's a bridge. Maybe if you can shed some light on this, given your experience, Dr. Jeffrey, because you've been on both sides of the table. And maybe you can say, how is it possible for an institution like, let's say, IIUM, which focuses on value-based economics, right, to kind of be able to reach out in a pragmatic manner with the industry, because they tend to say that we're not really in touch with reality. The things that we're suggesting doesn't affect the triple bottom line in a negative way. So how is it that we can address this gap?
So when I am consulting with businesses, they say I'm too academic. When I'm in an academic community, they say I'm too business oriented, and I know. And so it is quite difficult to balance that. But I think the only thing that we can do actually as academics is do our research objectively, straightforwardly, and just present it to them. And if they don't listen, just speak louder and tell them, yeah. Because actually this is in the New York Times. And this is about academic research. And it's not true that academic research is not relevant. I write, a weekly article. I don't do a bibliographic search, and it's not going to go into Scopus, but it is nonetheless based on the basic principles that basic academic principles, and that's why people read it. People do value academic research because they see it as evidence-based, they see it as objective, they see it as informed, and hopefully they see it without a confirmation bias. And we should feel confident about that. And industries will look at it. They will take it or leave it according to what's relevant to them. But if it's not relevant to them, it doesn't mean it's not relevant to somebody else, and it's not relevant for us to say it. We just need to be confident about what we do as academics and as academic institutions, because these businessmen used to be our students. So, and their children will be our students, so they better be careful about what they say.
Okay, maybe we can have another round of questions. Yeah, Dr. Izam, maybe let me get a mic to you. I'm trying to get the mic to you. So,
Thank you, Dr. Desat, and thank you, Dr. Jeffrey Williams, for the discussion on this issue. is it fair for me to say that from your observations and your interaction with the people in the industry, that the intention of us having CSR being promoted and also having all those sustainability reporting being imposed on the public listed companies are not actually yielding the desired results, yeah, in terms of creating the right incentives for these companies to do more CSR initiatives that have actual positive impact to the people. And this is my first question. And secondly, I'm sure you are aware of the link between SRI and CSR, and we were hoping that with this link, the SRI will create that economic incentive for companies to do CSR because they will be, filtered in the investment portfolio. But we also recognize that this may not have direct impact on the behavior of the companies, as you have highlighted earlier. We have, under the SRI universe, one component called impact investing, and I'm sure that this is a much more direct link, yeah, between investment and actual positive impact to the society when you are directly investing in companies with direct interaction with the people, trying to solve the need of the people or to solve the problems of the people on the ground, or coming up with environmentally friendly technologies directly. Yeah? So we had the experience of the government, the Malaysian government, introducing the social impact exchange. Yeah? But I think this is already not continued or discontinued. I'm not sure. May I have your comment on this? What is happening to the social impact exchange, and whether you think this model, in terms of promoting impact investing, will have a more direct impact on achieving sustainable development goals in Malaysia? Thank you very much.
Okay, so the first question was about the disclosure, the question of reporting and disclosure, and whether that leads to change in businesses. I think that the advocates of better disclosure, and I'm one of them, actually. I remember in 2006 that the Institute of Integrity, remember that? I don't know if it's still operating. The Institute of Integrity in Malaysia asked me for their input into the budget. They said, how can we change the budget in such a way as to promote corporate responsibility? And I said, you just get in the budget speech a line saying it will now be mandatory for the companies to disclose on their corporate responsibility. And that Abdullah Badawi put that in the budget, and that's where it started. And the idea was that the greater disclosure would cause better performance. But actually that presupposes that the performance was bad to begin with. And actually what we found was that the greater disclosure was showing that the performance was actually not that bad. Not to say it was brilliant, but it was not that bad. And once you have greater disclosure, you then come to the conclusion that, well, what should we do to make it very much better? And then it's a cost benefit issue. And then the answer to that is, well, we don't need to do very much. So actually, what has been the effect of the disclosure? It's been, well, some companies want to improve, so they have, and they saw that they were not so good and that they could improve. And other companies said, well, it's not so bad, so we don't need to change. And I might also have been responsible for that, because whenever I wrote a sustainability report, it always got an A+ from the GRI. Every single one of my reports got an A+. And the reason for that is not because I cheated with the report. It's because I applied the principle of materiality. Every other report was trying to report on everything. And Maybank said, what can we say about fish? And we said, there's nothing, you don't do any fishing. And we applied the principle of materiality and only reported on the material issues. And they always did well on the material issues. And then unfortunately, they stopped doing it. They
So
said,
the A+ is on the report, the purpose of the company.
exactly, exactly. So then basically you have the good reports. And what the companies were doing was looking for evidence to meet, finding the positive confirmation bias. And of course, they never reported bad things. They never would. So the reporting has been mixed, but I think it actually shows us that it wasn't actually quite as bad as people presume, but it hasn't necessarily been a push for improvements. It hasn't had the impact of social. Now, the second is on SRI and impacting investment in particular. Just on SRI in general terms, the impact of SRI, that's socially responsible investment, is the same as the reporting, which is we hoped that the SRI funds would push better performance, but actually they don't. They sort of look for the good performance first, and then they come after it. They chase the good performance rather than push the good. And second, the impact investment was, this is the idea that you will specifically invest in companies or enterprises that definitely will have a good social impact. That's the complete focus of your portfolio. And the question was, what happened to that? And the answer is, I don't know. But it certainly didn't take off in the way that we might have hoped. But it might be because many of these programs already have government funding. And so the government crowds out that type of activity. Yeah. So an impact investment project might be to support low-income group entrepreneurialism, for example. But then SME Bank does this, or the government does this through various ministries. MARA does this, and MARA gives grants to rural communities to do this. So it might be that anything that the impact investment community might target is already being covered. So the answer is, I don't know, but I suspect there's something to that. And this is one reason why in Europe, they care more about environment than they do about social, because the government covers all of the social. You never expect corporates to cover social issues. You would never expect a company to open a clinic or open a school. You would never expect that. And if they did it, you would be suspicious of their motives, because all of that is covered by the government. But it's the environment that is not covered by the government.
But this is more unique to Europe than Americans.
Yes, in America, it's totally different. Yes.
Right, any other questions? Okay.
I started, so I should end.
Okay.
There's always a school of thought, I think a lot of discussion regarding circular economy. And apparently that has been the impetus that you should do. And currently we are still on linear thoughts. So what's your view on this? Should there be a change, or how shall we do?
Well, from an academic perspective, again, we have we're almost at this stage for circular economy type thing, which is to say we're still at the conceptualization phase. So most of the papers will be positive because they're conceptualizing, and they're saying if we adopt a circular economy approach, these are the type of things that we should be seeing. And of course, that would be interpreted in this approach, that would be interpreted as positive. But there's no evidence there because it's the conceptual phase. So in a thesis, it would be research questions, research hypotheses, conceptual model, and they still haven't done the survey. And then later on, when you do the survey, then you will get more evidence as to whether it's going to deliver benefits or not. And we're just not there yet. That's the issue. We need evidence to demonstrate that is true. The simple fact of it is, we have an economic model. It's called capitalism. And it is demonstrably the most successful thing at raising incomes that we have ever seen in the history of mankind. There is no question about that. On the evidence, that is the truth of it. Yeah. But it does have problems, of course. It's not, there's also no question that there are problems, right? So we are in a search for alternatives. And yet we have conceptualization of alternatives, but we don't yet have the evidence to show that the alternative is better than what we have, or that we need the alternative to solve the problems of what we have, whether they could be dealt with through redistribution, for example, or tweaking the system, or changing the legal frameworks.
So given where Malaysia is right now, let's say with its ESG initiatives, do you think the government's role has to change in any way? And if so, in what way?
I think the government should stop
Promoting
Yes,
ESG.
stop. I think the government should focus on the Madani principle for sustainability, which is to focus on raising people's income and improving the redistribution, creating greater income equality, helping people to deal with cost of living, helping people to deal with access to issues that they might be currently there might be barriers. But I think the other thing the government should do is to be a little, but I understand politically they might not be able to do it, but you know, the push for renewable energy is to sell it. And to sell it to get money. And then the money is then used for social development. In other words, change the way in which we understand it. In other words, what I'm saying is Malaysia has an opportunity in the Madani principles and the sustainability chapter of the Madani principles to establish its own conception of what sustainability means, does not need to adopt someone else's framework. Malaysia also has the fundamental foundations of Islam, which is the national religion, which already give you that principle. You do not need Jeffrey Sachs to tell you how to run a sustainable economy. You don't need him to do that.
So where
You need
does
Jeffrey Williams.
So where would that leave the ESG narrative? Meaning, does it mean that now we leave it to the industry to interpret it, or does it mean that we need to reinterpret ESG in terms of the Malaysian view of sustainability or the Madani
I
framework?
think the ESG narrative is a story being told by somebody else. So listen to it. If it's interesting, follow it. If it's boring, use your remote control and find something else. Find something else on Netflix and look at another story until you find the story that fits for you. But fundamentally, you want to ask the question, what is it that you want? Well, you want what everybody wants. Better incomes in a clean environment where people are treated with respect. All of these issues are not in dispute. Can you achieve that through a Malaysian approach, a Madani approach, or not a Madani approach, just a Malaysian approach? Can you achieve that? The answer is yes, you can. Yes, you can, and you can do it very much better than the Americans are doing it, and very much better than the Europeans are doing it. So why do you need them to tell you how to do it? You don't need them.
Okay, I think
And then here I am, a European. There is a certain irony. And he's going to point it out. He's going to rib me at that time.
so I think we've reached the conclusion, kind of like a full circle. We were talking about what our academic agenda is towards ESG, only to realize that maybe it's a completely different agenda in itself. So first of all, I think it's very important to recognize that the Center of Islamic Economics was doing this to clarify a lot of the stats that we have in terms of sustainable and humane development and what it means, as our post-conference agenda. And we're hoping that, the second one will follow through soon. We're in the midst of getting other speakers as well. And so that's where we are, and we will be informing you about it, right? So on that, I would like to invite our director for the Center of Islamic Economics to maybe give a few closing comments next session. I want.
I was supposed to be welcoming remarks, not.
It's circular in the end. We're a circular economic.
So, I think closing, just a few words, yeah. So I think we had a good session. Thank you very much, Prof. Jeffrey Williams, and also Prof. Mansoor Afifi, for the very insightful presentations and comments on the presentation. And we also had good questions, yeah, good questions from the participants physically and online. So I guess in the future we will continue, yeah, to organize this sort of for example programs, and I hope we will continue to get the support from everyone, yeah. So once again, I think we can give an applause to both our speakers. Also, we have some souvenirs for our speaker.
Okay, so I'd like to invite our director, Prof. Norma, and to the center stage.
I use these for my shopping. Yes, sustainable.
Useful.
Zero plastic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jeffrey Williams.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having a long session. Normally I get, they say 5 minutes only.
You keep coming, we'll extend that time.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Afifi. We'll send you a virtual gift. Right now. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. And I hope you're all able to overlook some of our shortcomings. You can see that we're still navigating the venue and trying to figure out the wiring here. But I think overall, the overall objectives of what we wanted to achieve, was achieved, and I think that's a huge plus. Usually we're constrained for time, but I think in this situation, this event, we were able to, let out a lot of the steam that was there. And I hope that, we're able to have the second one very soon, inshallah. Thank you very much. We will all break for lunch together. And with that, I would like to close today's session. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Lunch. Enjoy this for lunch.
The student to join the
Okay. Very interesting. Thank you. 3 hours.
Camera fell just now. Hopefully it's okay.
Yes.
Check it out.
I'm just here for lunch.
Just for the fruit.
Okay, the other glasses here. Yeah, get it.
Yeah, yeah, you have, well, once it needs to allow the evidence of the natural experiment. Another, yes, but another is because that should happen.
It was 11, yeah,
Proper
because
structure.
I joined it.
Uh,
Nobody commissioned it, because I think it doesn't matter.
The maybe took a picture while I'm waiting for sorry.
We never decided to have it on the track. To be honest, I will take picture. I will take a very strong picture. Oh. Ah, can we do it? Yeah, we can do it, I guess, after.
Yeah.
Yes,
Ah. Tapi dah paper itu ya.
already. Because I understand it because you are a busy person. Yeah,
Okay.
I know you are very busy. Yeah. At times, no.
No, no, yeah, it was just a very hectic time and